I've always been interested in paleontology. This started out when I was just 3 or 4 years old. I would name all the dinosaurs I knew to my grandfather. But, throughout my life, I've been interested in ancient life. Dinosaur toys are my favorite toys growing up. Always liked the dinosaurs. There were never enough dinosaur movies. I studied paleontology a little bit in college. Mostly it was zoology, but I took paleontology classes. And I was lucky enough to be raised in a land that had lots of dinosaur fossils. Utah. We're going to talk about the Yithians a little more and their evolution scientifically and the paleontology aspects of this. Now, Lovecraft tells us the Yithians evolved on Earth. They are Earth life. The protagonist of the story says that the Yithians are as much vegetable as an animal, which is a favorite thing of Lovecraft. He tries to describe the old ones that way, the fungi from Yuggoth. But really, the Yithians don't show any trace of plant life. I mean, they have eyes. They are sexless, and they reproduce through the zygotes released into the water. I mean, plants aren't any more sexless than animals. Some plants have zygotes in the water, a lot don't. The Yithians have green blood, but, plants don't actually have green blood or any blood at all. They might have sap, not quite the same. And I'm going to assume that the hero of the story, Professor Peasley, in fact, does not have entirely correct data because it just doesn't make sense. First of all, the Yithians don't have any part of plants. Maybe Peasley thought that since they spawn seeds in the water and have green blood, that shows they're part plant. But there's a large group of earth animals which do this, and they were just as important in the age of the dinosaurs as they are now. Remember, Peasley was a scientist, but he wasn't in a STEM category. Okay, mollusks are what I'm talking about. Mollusks are a huge and important group. They're certainly the most important advanced phylum which isn't segmented. Compared to the segmented vertebrates like us. You're thinking, how are we segmented? Think of our ribs, think of our vertebrae. We're segmented, Or insects are very segmented. Annelids, which are like earthworms and centipedes, they're very segmented. The echinoderms are another important group. That's starfish and sea urchins. They're not segmented, but I don't think they're as important as mollusks. For one thing, I like to eat mollusks a lot more than I like to eat echinoderms. In case you don't have a scientific background, what are mollusks? They are from the group that has snails, slugs, clams, squids, and a bunch of other less well-known creatures. They live on both land and sea. They live in freshwater and saltwater. They're really diverse. They can develop a high intelligence. We see this in octopi and squid. I know one scientist who thinks that octopi have human-level intelligence. They just don't get to express it entirely because they don't live very long, like less than a year. I'm not sure I buy the human-level intelligence thing, but they are really smart. Now, the most numerous mollusks are the gastropods, slugs and snails. I mean, all of us know about these. Heck, one of the very first dates with my now wife, we ate snails at the only French restaurant in Provo. Here's a fun fact. The pesky garden snail, common in California, are actually imported invasive French edible snails. So in theory, the snails in California are edible too, but purge their digestive tract first. I mean, if you pick them out of your garden, you're probably getting all kinds of stuff in their tummy that you don't want. If you're curious how to do it, look it up online. I know guys that did it and enjoyed the snails. So anyway, on to mollusks. So let's look at the facts. Yithians have a broad, flat foot they move on, like most mollusks. Think of chitons, snails, slugs. Even clams have a big muscular foot they dig with. Mussels do too, but their foot isn't used to dig with. They're used to weave fibers to attach into the rock. Yithians don't have male versus female sexes. Now, Peasley saw this as making them sexless, but again, there's plenty of mollusks that are hermaphrodites with no sexual distinction. Snails, for instance. And then there are mollusks that can switch between female and male, like oysters. Anyway, sex is not the same kind of predetermined thing it is in mammals. Yithians reproduce by releasing spawn into the water. Lots of mollusks do this. Most of them, in fact. This makes the Yithians a kind of amphibian, always tied to the water with water-dwelling larvae. Now, it's pretty clear that Yithians that are adults don't breathe water, quite the reverse, so they must wade into water to release their milt. I don't know if it's fresh or salt water or both, but now land-dwelling snails and slugs don't release spawn into the water. They mate. But because the Yithians are so tied to the water, I believe they are only recently adapted to land life. That means we need to seek out their ancestor among water-dwelling creatures. My candidate for the Yithian ancestor are the Monoplacophoran, a kind of obscure group. Let's analyze them. First, Lovecraft says that the Yithian ancestors aren't known to science. This was true in his day. The Monoplacophorans were recognized in 1952. after he died. The Yithians have a central big round foot, just like the Monoplacophorans. Now, if you look at this image, you can see that the shell of the Monoplacophoran is kind of cone-shaped, but what you probably don't realize is that the cone goes to the front of the animal, not the back, like in a snail or a clam. In other words, it's got a cone-shaped body with a shell on it, but it's cone-shaped going forward, which is like the Yithians. The Monoplacophorans, they release tiny young, in their case, less than a third of a millimeter. I mean, I can't put my hands close enough to do it, which is like what the Yithians do. And finally, mollusks, and this isn't just Monoplacophorans, it's all of them. They have a radula. Now, a radula is a tongue. It has spines or barbs or rasps, and they use it to scrape holes in rocks, spear prey animals, inject poison in some cases, otherwise feed. The tongue's boneless with a hardened surface on the outside. Now, the Yithians actually have 4 boneless limbs. One ends in a feeding mouth, and 3 of them have hardened, horny ends on the outside, modified for grasping. I count this as a development of the radula. Now, Yithians do have lots of features that are not shown in Monoplacophores. Yithians have eyes. Monoplacophores don't. Of course, they live in the deep sea. Why would they now? Yithians don't have a shell, at least not externally. They might have a retained part of it internally. Who knows? Yithians have 4 extensions of their body, 2 grasping limbs, 1 sensory organ, 1 feeding organ. Now, plenty of mollusks have tentacles like this, not just octopuses, but cone shells, scallops, tusk shells, slugs, and so forth. Monoplacophorans are some of the few that don't. Also, Monoplacophorans are not amazing for their brain size, but probably neither were the ancestors of octopuses, and look at them now. So the Yithians have clearly evolved far beyond the primitive ancestors. Another awesome feature of the Yithians is that without any hard parts, like a slug or an octopus, they wouldn't fossilize. We don't have a ton of fossil octopuses. We don't have fossil slugs. These things don't preserve because they like no shells. So we wouldn't find them. So the Yithians we also wouldn't find. And make it even worse for the Yithians, they don't live in the water. They live on land, which means for them to fossilize, they have to die on land, be washed into the water, get buried under silt, and then be preserved. And that is like just not very likely. You know, dinosaurs, it works for them because they have bones. Yithians don't have bones. And so if they died, I doubt that huge rotting carcass with no bones would last more than, you know, a couple days, not enough time to fossilize. So we wouldn't have fossils of them. We'd have fossils of their buildings, but I've addressed this in another video. You know, in other words, mind control. Let's talk more about the Yithians. Was their evolution guided to make these creatures? I don't think so, because the Yithians are cherry-picking races to become. You know, they wouldn't build a race to be normally, because they would just go find a good race, and if someone else had made that race, they would take it over, or take over the guys that are making them, even more likely. So they don't need, they have all the universe to choose from. They don't need to like build a new race for themselves. They have all time and space. Now, something to remember about the Yithians or old ones is that these are basically entire species in which even the low-end characters are as smart as a Newton or an Einstein or a Darwin. If the Yithian brain is kept in the top of the cone, which is where I think it is, then this brain should probably be about 12 to 20 times the size of a human brain. Now, we don't know how much more or maybe less efficient than our brains theirs are, but that's plenty of reasoning power to spare, even if some of it has to be used up in managing their many appendages. 2 claws, 4 mouths, 8 fine manipulation tentacles. So with this much brain power, I doubt they need computers for math calculations. Their gigantic brains would enable this on their own for any but the most abstruse calculations, in the same way that the greatest mathematicians of humankind could make these. And like I said, even the average Yithian is like the greatest mathematician we can produce. Now, they're time travelers. I did a video, which I'm hoping Edgar will show now. What would a time traveler be like? I posit here that time travelers are the most destructive, rapacious entities possible. My example is, a time traveler would think it's fine to go to the Taj Mahal and tear it down to use the marble as building blocks, because to the time traveler, the Taj Mahal is still there. It's just yesterday is all. The Yithians would see things in this way. If they want to understand or visit something from the distant past or the future, they just go visit it. And we also know if they want to avoid something really bad, they simply send their minds away. Now, the actual intelligence differential between Yithians and humans is probably not as great as humans and bacteria, truthfully. After all, we do have an entire civilization, which, like bacteria, don't. But the Yithians are still vastly beyond us. Still, even with our limited wisdom, we can figure out some aspects of Yithian life and biology. Like me. Subscribe to me. Get notifications if you want. And buy this item or consider it from my website. That's petersengames.com. Thanks.